Man's wish to help an old neighbor sleeping in her car for weeks leaves her homeless. We see our neighbors most of the days of our lives, but there are few neighbors with whom we become really close, right? So let's ask you something. What would you do if one sudden morning while going to work you see one of your neighbors sleeping in their car? Obviously not yours. You might think, so what if my neighbor's sleeping in the car? That's their personal choice. But wouldn't you be a little curious finding that person sleeping in the car for several days in a row? And remember, that person has a home. That's why they're your neighbor. But what was the reason this woman was sleeping in her car instead of the cozy bed in her house? This story is something incredible, and the guy saw his old neighbor sleeping in her car. But why? The question took away his sleep, and when this old lady told him the real reason, he was shocked. But what happened that made this guy burn down her house, even when he knew his neighbor was living in a car? Kevin Burns saw his elderly woman neighbor sleeping in their car. For the first 2-3 days, he didn't give this much thought, but things started to bother him when she was still there for over a week. What could have happened to her? Kevin thought about it many times. Being a responsible neighbor, he didn't wait much longer and asked. That's Ruth's black car and Ruth in the picture. Instead of living inside her house, she found comfort in her small black car. There are times when we take some drastic steps in our lives. These big steps might seem weird to other people, but we know what we're doing. Kevin was struggling with the same situation. This woman had a nice house but was living in a car. Why? He found out soon enough. From his house window, Kevin could see this old woman sleeping in her car, looking towards the house as if she just wants to run towards it, but something was holding her back. Kevin could see Ruth drifting away in her sleep, which made Kevin sleepy. For several nights, this became Kevin's nightly routine, staring at his neighbor with no idea in the world why she was behaving that way. What was the reason? Was she hiding something in the house? Not knowing how to approach her, Kevin called out softly. She didn't respond and came out of the car. Generally, people asked us to come inside the house for tea and snacks. Even she invited him, but it was the car mini home she called. She asked Kevin to come sit in her new house. Watching her behave like this, Kevin couldn't stop worrying about Ruth. For Kevin, Ruth was the mystery which he needed to solve before it got too late. What was inside the house that kept her out of it? It seemed like nothing was working on Ruth. There were no answers from her side that could tell Kevin what made her take such a drastic measure in her life. At this age, too. Being old is another kind of struggle in itself. Kevin's heart was drenching in pain seeing this old woman in this condition, but he still needed to earn her trust before he could find out what was going on. Kevin sat beside her in the car with no one speaking any word as they sat there for a while. Kevin couldn't take it any longer and asked Ruth about it. She didn't say anything at the time, and Kevin didn't feel like pushing any further. She already seemed lost, so Kevin moved out of the car, leaving Ruth behind, wishing to call out her name. But he was already counting his house stairs, and nothing.